Good evening, and welcome to the Sleepless Curiosity. I'm glad you're here tonight, wherever in the world you're settling in from. Here's the strange thought we're sitting with tonight. Somewhere in the future, a ship has to leave Earth and never come back. Not for a few years. Forever, and that means it can't just carry people. It has to carry everything a planet quietly does for them, without them ever noticing it's being done. Think about what Earth actually gives you for free, right now, while you lie there listening. Air that refills itself, gravity that never once glitches, rain that falls, soil that grows things, a magnetic field standing guard overhead, keeping the worst of space away from your skin. You've never had to manage a single one of those things. They just happen. On a ship, every one of them has to be built. Every one has to be run by a machine for centuries without failing, because there is no rescue coming and no second planet waiting nearby. One small favour before we drift into it. While you're getting comfortable, leave a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. It always amazes me how far these quiet little broadcasts travel. So settle in, get cozy, and let's ask the question that should be a little unsettling. What does it actually take to fake an entire world well enough that no one on board ever guesses it's fake? And how long can a lie that size hold together? Start with a single number, because numbers are where this story has to begin. To reach even the nearest plausible stars with any technology we can currently imagine building, a crewed ship would need to travel for centuries. Not years. Centuries. Multiple human generations. Born, raised, grown old and buried, all inside the same hull. Having never once felt wind on their skin or seen a horizon that wasn't curved by engineering. The people who arrive were never the people who left. Their grandparents made that decision for them, and there is no way to ask permission from someone who hasn't been born yet. This is the plan physicists and engineers call a generation ship, and it is, without much exaggeration, the most demanding machine anyone has ever seriously proposed building, not because of the engines, not because of the fuel, because of what has to happen inside the hull once the engines stop mattering and life simply has to continue the way it continues on a planet for as long as it takes to get somewhere else. Here's the part that quietly changes the whole problem. When you send astronauts to the International Space Station, you are not asking the station to be self-sufficient. You are asking it to survive for months at a time while a continuous, reliable supply chain feeds it from below. Cargo capsules arrive on a schedule. Water, food, spare parts, replacement filters, all of it climbs up out of Earth's gravity well and docks with the station every few weeks. The station doesn't have to solve its own problems forever. It only has to hold the line until the next resupply. A generation ship gets no resupply, ever, the moment it leaves Earth orbit. It is alone in the most literal sense any human structure has ever been alone. There is no cargo ship following behind with spare oxygen scrubbers. There is no mission control that can simply launch a rescue capsule if a critical system starts failing. Whatever leaves the solar system has to contain, within its own walls, every single thing a human body and a human society will need for centuries. Or it has to be capable of manufacturing those things indefinitely from whatever raw material it happens to be carrying. There's no third option. There's no room for a shrug and a promise to fix it next year. So try for a moment to make the list, not a rough sketch. An actual list of everything Earth quietly provides that a spaceship would have to replace. Start with the obvious one. Air, breathable air, at the right pressure, with the right mix of gases, scrubbed of carbon dioxide continuously, refreshed with oxygen continuously, moving gently enough that it doesn't feel like living inside an air conditioning duct, but thoroughly enough that no stagnant pocket ever builds up behind a locked door. Earth does this for the entire planet using nothing but sunlight, plants, oceans, and about 4 billion years of chemistry that nobody designed. A ship has to do it using machines that somebody built 5, 10, 15 generations before the air is actually being breathed by the people who need it. Then water. Not water that gets replaced from an external source when it runs low, because there is no external source. Water that gets used, contaminated, filtered, purified, and used again, over and over, in a loop so tight that the same molecules that once passed through your great-great-grandmother's kidneys are, statistically, passing through yours right now. On Earth, the water cycle runs on solar energy and gravity, evaporating from oceans, falling as rain, filtering through soil and rock, and returning to the sea to begin again, all without a single moving part built by human hands. On a ship, every stage of that cycle has to be replaced by hardware. Evaporation becomes a mechanical distillation unit. Filtration through rock becomes a stack of engineered membranes that clog, degrade, and eventually need replacing by people who were never trained by anyone who remembers installing the originals. Then food. Not stored food, because no cargo hold on Earth is large enough to feed a population for centuries, and even if it were, nutrients degrade. And a diet of preserved rations for 600 years is its own kind of slow catastrophe. Food has to be grown. That means agriculture has to exist on board, permanently, which means soil or some engineered substitute for soil has to exist on board permanently, which means the entire underground world of microbes, fungi, and nutrient cycling that makes soil fertile on Earth has to be either imported in miniature or invented from scratch and kept alive across centuries without a single collapse. A failed harvest on Earth is a regional tragedy. A failed harvest on a generation ship, if it isn't caught early enough and corrected, is the beginning of the end for everyone aboard, because there is no neighbouring country to import grain from at the next system over. Then gravity, or something convincing enough to stand in for it, because human bones and human hearts were built by 4 billion years of evolution under a very specific, very constant pull. And without it, bodies begin to fail in ways that are well documented from decades of research on astronauts. Bone density dropping, muscles wasting, fluid shifting toward the head in ways that damage eyesight over long enough exposure. A ship built for centuries can't treat weightlessness as a temporary inconvenience the way a 6-month mission can. It has to solve gravity the way a planet solves it, which usually means spinning some section of the hull fast enough and building it large enough. That centripetal force can convincingly stand in for something the universe normally gives away for free. Then radiation. Earth wraps itself in 2 separate forms of protection that most people never think about because they've never had to. There's the atmosphere, thick enough to absorb the worst of what the sun throws at us, and there's the magnetic field, generated by a slowly churning ocean of molten iron thousands of kilometers beneath your feet, deflecting charged particles around the planet like a shield you've never once had to charge or maintain. A ship in deep space, far from any planet's magnetic field, sits exposed to a much harsher radiation environment than anything on Earth's surface ever experiences. And building an artificial magnetosphere or thick enough physical shielding to protect a population for centuries is its own entire branch of unsolved engineering. And that's before you even reach the parts of a planet that aren't obviously mechanical at all. The changing of seasons that regulates crop cycles and human circadian rhythm. The vast buffering capacity of oceans that quietly absorb chemical imbalances before they become dangerous. The sheer scale of Earth's biosphere, which means that a single failing ecosystem in one corner of the globe rarely threatens the whole. A ship, by contrast, is small enough that a single failing subsystem can cascade into every other subsystem within days, because everything on board is connected, sealed, and interdependent in a way nothing on Earth has ever had to be. This is the actual shape of the problem, and it's worth sitting with before we go any further tonight, because it reframes everything that follows. Building a ship that can survive the vacuum of space for a few years is difficult but well understood. Building a ship that can replace an entire planet's worth of quietly running, self-correcting, 4-billion-year-old life support systems and keep them running not for years but for centuries without a single planetary safety net beneath it is a problem of an entirely different order. And the people who have actually tried to design one, going back decades now, keep arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. The engines are the easy part. What comes next is the story of everything else. Part 2. The problem nobody wanted to admit was serious. The idea of a ship that carries a civilization across centuries didn't start as an engineering proposal. It started, quietly and almost embarrassingly, as science fiction, and for a long time that was exactly why serious scientists avoided touching it. Nobody wants to spend a career on a footnote that gets filed under fantasy. But the math kept refusing to go away, and eventually the math won, the way it usually does. The distances involved are the whole reason this conversation exists at all. The nearest star system to our own, Alpha Centauri, sits a little over 4 light years away. That number sounds almost approachable when you say it quickly. 4 light years. It doesn't sound like much until you translate it into something a human being can actually feel. Light itself, the fastest thing in the universe, the thing nothing with mass will ever outrun, takes just over 4 years to cross that gap. And we are nowhere close to moving at the speed of light. The fastest object humanity has ever built, a spacecraft that used a close pass by the sun to sling itself outward at extraordinary velocity, would still take on the order of tens of thousands of years to cross that same distance if it were aimed at Alpha Centauri instead of looping back toward the outer solar system. Tens of thousands of years. Sit with that number for a moment, because it's the number that quietly forces every other decision in this story. Even with dramatically improved propulsion, engines we can currently sketch on paper but haven't built, engines using nuclear fusion or antimatter reactions or exotic beam-driven sails pushed by lasers from Earth, the most optimistic serious estimates for a crewed interstellar journey still land somewhere between 1 and several centuries. Not because engineers lack imagination, but because there is a hard physical ceiling on how fast anything with mass can be safely accelerated, how much fuel it would need to carry to reach and then decelerate from extreme velocities, and how much energy that fuel represents. The rocket equation, the same brutally simple piece of mathematics that governs every launch from Earth, becomes exponentially crueler the faster and farther you try to go. Carry more fuel, and you need more fuel to carry that fuel. The curve doesn't bend gently, it goes vertical. So the timeline that keeps surviving every serious study, from Cold War era think tanks to modern academic papers, sits somewhere in the range of decades to centuries, depending entirely on how much energy humanity is willing and able to throw at the problem. And the moment that number crosses roughly one human lifetime, an entirely different kind of engineering problem opens up beneath your feet. You are no longer designing a vehicle for a crew. You are designing an inheritance for people who don't exist yet, using resources decided by people who will be dead before their descendants ever see a star that isn't the sun. This is where the idea of the generation ship, sometimes called a world ship, actually enters the scientific literature, and it enters earlier than most people assume. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the Russian schoolteacher whose equations still govern every rocket launch today, floated the idea of a self-sufficient space colony as early as the first decades of the 20th century, decades before anyone had put a satellite into orbit. He wasn't writing fiction. He was working through the same brutal arithmetic everyone since has had to work through, and he arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. If humanity was ever going to leave the solar system with the propulsion physics allows, someone was going to have to build something that could function as a complete, closed civilization for a very long time. The idea resurfaced with more mathematical rigor in the middle of the 20th century when physicist John Desmond Bernal proposed large rotating space habitats as a plausible long-term human environment, and the concept was picked up and refined further by physicist Freeman Dyson and by engineers working through what became known as world ship studies. Formal technical papers exploring exactly how large a ship would need to be, how it would need to be shielded, how its population would need to be structured, and how its systems would need to be designed to survive not a single crew's lifetime, but dozens of lifetimes stacked end to end. What these studies kept converging on independently across different decades and different assumptions about propulsion technology was a strange and slightly unsettling shape. The ship, whatever form it took, needed to stop looking like a vehicle and start looking like a place. Not a rocket with people strapped inside it, enduring the journey the way astronauts endure a mission. A location, a society, something large enough, redundant enough, and self-correcting enough that it could weather not just mechanical failure, but human failure too. Wars, accidents, bad decisions, disease outbreaks, and the slow social drift that happens naturally to any group of people left alone together for long enough. Here's the detail that tends to surprise people the most when they first encounter these studies seriously. The engineering problem of moving mass through space at survivable acceleration turns out to be, in relative terms, the well-understood part. We know how nuclear fusion works in principle. We understand the physics of light sails pushed by external lasers. We have working, if primitive, designs for both. The genuinely unsolved problem, the one that every serious world ship study spends the overwhelming majority of its pages on, is not propulsion, it's closure. It's the question of whether a sealed system containing a few thousand people, a finite quantity of water, a finite quantity of usable soil, and a fixed set of machinery can actually remain stable chemically, biologically, and socially for the 200, 300, or 400 years the journey demands. Because here's the quiet trap hiding inside the whole idea. A ship travelling for 400 years doesn't get to have a bad decade. It doesn't get to have a war or a poorly managed harvest, or a generation that neglects maintenance because morale is low and nobody quite believes in the mission anymore. On Earth, a civilization that makes a catastrophic mistake has an entire planet's worth of buffer to absorb it. Other regions keep functioning. Other ecosystems keep cycling nutrients. The damage stays local most of the time, and recovery is possible because the system is enormous compared to the wound. A ship has no such buffer. Every system is coupled to every other system. A failure in the water recycling loop becomes a failure in agriculture within weeks. A failure in agriculture becomes a failure in the social contract within months. There is no neighboring nation to buy grain from. There is no ocean large enough to quietly absorb the mistake. There is only the hull and everyone inside it together for the rest of the trip. This is the reason the studies keep landing on population numbers that sound almost absurdly large for a spacecraft. Early rough estimates from the mid-20th century suggested a crew in the low thousands might be sufficient. Later, more careful analysis, factoring in genetic diversity, the need for specialized skills across generations, and the simple demographic math of birth rates, death rates, and accidents over centuries pushed that number significantly higher, into the tens of thousands in some models. Not because a smaller ship couldn't physically survive the trip, but because a smaller population couldn't survive the trip without collapsing genetically or socially or both long before the ship ever reached its destination. And that number, tens of thousands of people, changes the entire character of the design problem. You are no longer building a spacecraft. You are building a small sealed nation. One that has to reproduce every essential function of a planet on a scale small enough to fit inside a hull and durable enough to run without a single planetary scale failsafe for longer than most empires in human history have managed to survive intact. Which brings us, finally, to the number that gives tonight's story its real shape. The number that every serious world ship study eventually has to confront directly. If a ship has to replace everything a planet does, air, water, food, gravity, radiation shielding, seasons, soil, and the slow invisible chemistry that keeps a biosphere in balance, then the ship isn't really a ship at all in the way we normally use that word. It's a miniature, artificial Earth, built by people who will never see it finished, carried by people who never chose to be born there, toward a destination that exists, for most of the journey, only as a number in a navigation computer and a story told to children who have never seen a star up close. And the first, and in some ways the most brutal, of all those systems to design is the one everyone assumes is simple. Air will go there next. Part 3. The air that has to forget it's manufactured. Start with the simplest possible question, the one that seems almost too obvious to ask seriously. What happens if the air just runs out? Not dramatically, not in an explosion or a hull breach, but slowly, quietly, the way a small leak in a tire eventually leaves you stranded on the side of a road you never expected to stop on. On a generation ship, that leak isn't measured in hours or days. It's measured in centuries, and the terrifying part is that a system built to compensate for a slow leak across 400 years has almost no margin for the kind of error that would be trivial to fix on Earth. Here's the number that tends to stop people cold the first time they hear it. A single adult human being breathes in roughly 11,000 litres of air every single day, extracting the oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide in a rhythm so automatic that most people go their entire lives without consciously thinking about it even once. Multiply that by tens of thousands of people every day for 400 years, and you begin to see the scale of what has to be managed, not stored. Managed continuously, because there is no tank large enough, no cargo hold deep enough to simply carry 4 centuries of breathable air along for the ride. The air has to be made over and over by the same finite supply of oxygen atoms, cycling endlessly through lungs, machines, and whatever biological systems the ship carries with it. On Earth, this entire problem is solved by something so vast and so quietly efficient that most of us never learn to appreciate it properly. Photosynthesis, trillions of individual plants and algae spread across every ocean and every continent, using nothing but sunlight to split water and carbon dioxide apart, releasing oxygen as what is essentially a waste product of their own survival. The scale of it is almost impossible to hold in your head. The oceans alone, mostly through microscopic phytoplankton too small to see with the naked eye, are responsible for producing roughly half of all the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere. Half from organisms most people have never heard of, quietly working an unpaid shift that has been running uninterrupted for more than 2 billion years. A ship cannot carry an ocean. This is, in the most literal sense, the entire problem in miniature. Every solution a ship proposes for its atmosphere is really an attempt to compress an ocean's worth of quiet biological labour into something small enough to fit inside a hull, reliable enough to run without direct supervision for centuries, and redundant enough that a single failure doesn't become a death sentence for everyone breathing that air. The International Space Station gives us the closest real-world glimpse of what this actually looks like in practice, and it is, even at a scale of just a handful of astronauts, a genuinely delicate operation. The station's environmental control and life support system, engineers simply call it ECLUS, uses a piece of hardware called the Oxygen Generation System, which splits water into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis, essentially running electricity through water the way you might have done with a battery and 2 wires in a school science class, except at a scale precise enough to keep 6 or 7 human beings alive in the vacuum of space. The oxygen gets released into the cabin. The hydrogen, historically, was simply vented overboard as waste, until engineers realized that venting it was, in effect, throwing away a resource the station couldn't easily replace. Later systems were redesigned to combine that waste hydrogen with the carbon dioxide astronauts exhale, running it through a device called a Sabatier reactor, which converts it back into water and methane, recovering some of what would otherwise have been lost to space forever. That detail matters more than it first appears to, because it captures the entire philosophy a generation ship has to adopt toward literally everything on board. Nothing is waste. Nothing gets vented, discarded, or treated as disposable, because there is no resupply ship arriving next month with a fresh tank of hydrogen. Every atom that leaves the system has to be considered a loss the ship can never fully recover from, and over 400 years, even tiny, seemingly negligible losses compound into a crisis if nobody accounts for them. Carbon dioxide removal is the other half of the equation, and it turns out to be, if anything, the harder engineering problem. The IS uses equipment that essentially works like a chemical sponge, absorbing carbon dioxide from the cabin air and later releasing it so the sponge material can be reused. A technology derived from systems developed for submarines, which faced a strikingly similar problem decades earlier. Sealed underwater for months at a time, with a crew that had absolutely nowhere else to get air from. Submarines, in a very real sense, were humanity's first working proof that a sealed environment could sustain human life indefinitely without surfacing. And much of the early thinking behind closed-loop life support traces directly back to naval engineers solving exactly this problem for the crews of nuclear submarines during the Cold War. But here is where the numbers stop being reassuring and start becoming genuinely uncomfortable. The systems on board the IS, sophisticated as they are, still aren't perfectly closed. A meaningful percentage of the water and oxygen used aboard the station is still, even today, supplemented by cargo missions launched from Earth, because achieving a truly complete closed loop, one that loses essentially nothing over time, has proven to be extraordinarily difficult even at the small scale of a single space station with a handful of occupants. Every inefficiency, every small leak in the loop, every percentage point of oxygen or water that doesn't get perfectly recovered is currently patched by simply sending more up from the planet below. A generation ship doesn't have that option. There is no planet below. Whatever inefficiency exists in the loop on departure day has to either be solved completely, engineered down to a rate of loss so small it becomes negligible across 4 centuries, or the ship has to carry a reserve so enormous it defeats the entire purpose of trying to build something that can actually survive the journey. This is the quiet, unglamorous engineering problem sitting underneath the entire concept of a world ship, and it's the reason serious researchers spend far more time thinking about chemistry and biology than they do thinking about engines. You can build an engine that works once and keep using it. You cannot build a closed-loop atmosphere that works once. It has to keep working without meaningful degradation for longer than most nations in human history have managed to survive without collapsing. This is also where plants come back into the story, not as decoration, not as a pleasant garden for the crew to walk through on a quiet evening, but as load-bearing infrastructure, every bit as critical as the electrical wiring or the water pumps. A ship large enough to carry tens of thousands of people would almost certainly need to grow its own crops for food, regardless of the atmosphere question. And it turns out those same crops can do meaningful work toward keeping the air breathable, absorbing carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen through the same photosynthetic process that keeps Earth's atmosphere in balance, just at a vastly smaller scale. But smaller scale means smaller margin, and this is precisely where one of the most famous and most sobering experiments in the history of closed system science comes into the picture. In the early 1990s, a research project in the Arizona desert called Biosphere 2 attempted something remarkably close to a scaled-down version of exactly this problem. A team of researchers sealed themselves inside a large, self-contained glass and steel structure containing multiple miniature ecosystems, a rainforest, a small ocean, a desert, agricultural land, all designed to sustain a crew of 8 people for 2 years using nothing but what was contained inside the sealed structure. It remains, to this day, one of the most ambitious attempts humanity has ever made to build a closed, self-sustaining biosphere from scratch. It did not go smoothly. Oxygen levels inside the structure began falling almost immediately after sealing, dropping over roughly a year and a half from a normal atmospheric level down to a point low enough that it began to genuinely endanger the health of the people living inside, forcing researchers to eventually pump supplemental oxygen in from outside, an option a ship crossing interstellar space would never, under any circumstances, have available to it. The cause, when researchers finally traced it down, turned out to be soil microbes in the structure's agricultural areas consuming oxygen and producing carbon dioxide at a rate nobody had fully anticipated, combined with unexpectedly high concentrations of concrete inside the structure absorbing carbon dioxide from the air and locking it away in a chemical reaction nobody had accounted for in the original design. Sit with that for a moment, because it's a genuinely important detail. The single largest failure in humanity's most serious attempt to build a closed biosphere wasn't caused by a mechanical part breaking. It wasn't a pump failure or a software bug. It was caused by concrete quietly reacting with the air in a way the designers hadn't predicted. and by soil microbes doing exactly what soil microbes have always done, consuming oxygen at a rate the team's models simply hadn't captured correctly. The atmosphere of an entire sealed world was thrown out of balance by chemistry nobody thought to model carefully enough, inside a project run by some of the most careful, well-funded scientists working on the problem at the time. That's the lesson a generation ship has to absorb before it ever leaves the ground. It isn't enough to build redundant machines. The atmosphere of a sealed world is a living chemical system, constantly shifting, constantly being nudged by things as mundane as the walls it's built from and the soil growing its food, and every one of those quiet, easily overlooked variables has to be understood, modelled and monitored continuously for centuries by people who will never once get to open a window and let fresh air in from outside, because there is no outside. There is only the hull and the air trapped within it, and the very long list of things quietly working every second to keep that air breathable. Part 4. The water that has already been someone else's. There's a fact about the water inside a sealed spacecraft that tends to unsettle people the first time they properly understand it, and it isn't really about hygiene, it's about time. On a generation ship, the water that fills a child's cup 300 years into the voyage isn't new water. It can't be. It's the same water, cycled and recycled, filtered and refiltered, that was loaded into the tanks on the day the ship left Earth. It has been inside other bodies. It has been sweat and tears and the condensation on the inside of a helmet and the runoff from a shower taken by someone who has been dead for 2 centuries. It has been recovered from urine and from the humidity breathed out by every lung on board, over and over, endlessly, because there is nowhere else for new water to come from. That sentence tends to provoke a small flinch the first time people hear it, and it's worth sitting with that flinch for a moment because it's actually a very useful reaction. It's the same reaction astronauts on the International Space Station had to work through when engineers first proposed recycling the crew's own urine back into drinking water. The idea sounds unpleasant in the abstract. In practice, the chemistry involved is genuinely remarkable, and it's already been proven quietly and successfully in low Earth orbit for years. The ISS runs a piece of hardware called the Water Recovery System, and its job is to take every source of moisture available on the station, urine, sweat, the humidity that condenses out of the cabin air every time someone breathes, and turn it back into water clean enough to drink. Clean enough, according to NASA's own engineers, to actually exceed the purity standards of most municipal tap water on Earth. The process runs through multiple stages of filtration and distillation, removing salts, contaminants, and anything biological, until what comes out the other end is, by any measurable chemical standard, purer than what flows out of a kitchen faucet in most cities on the planet the water originally came from. The station system currently recovers somewhere in the range of 90 to 98% of the water put into the loop, depending on the specific hardware configuration and how well everything happens to be running at a given time. That number sounds impressively close to perfect, and for a space station resupplied every few weeks by cargo missions from Earth, it's more than good enough. The small percentage that gets lost, evaporated into unrecoverable vapor, absorbed into materials that can't easily be wrung out, simply gets replaced on the next resupply flight, the way a slow leak in a tire gets topped up at a gas station before anyone lets it become a real problem. A generation ship does not get a next resupply flight. This is the detail that turns a merely impressive engineering achievement into a genuinely terrifying long-term constraint. If a ship's water recovery system operates at 95% efficiency losing 5% of its water to the environment with every cycle. That sounds, on paper, almost identical to the loss rate on the IS. But run that same 5% loss forward across not weeks, not months, but 4 centuries of continuous cycling, and the math turns brutal very quickly. A loss that seems negligible at the scale of a single mission becomes an existential slow bleed at the scale of a multi-generational voyage, and by the time anyone notices the tanks running critically low, there is no launch pad on Earth close enough to send help. This is why the actual engineering target for a true generation ship's water system isn't 95% or even 99%. It has to approach something close to total closure, a recovery rate so near to perfect that losses become effectively negligible, even multiplied across hundreds of years. And achieving that level of closure reliably, using hardware that has to keep functioning without failure for centuries, remains one of the genuinely unsolved problems sitting at the heart of every serious world ship proposal. And water recovery is only half the story, because water on a ship this size isn't just for drinking. It's for agriculture, and agriculture is, by a wide margin, the thirstiest system on board. Growing enough food to feed tens of thousands of people for centuries requires water on a scale that dwarfs simple human consumption, and every drop used to irrigate crops has to eventually be recovered too, pulled back out of the air as humidity, drained and filtered from the soil or growing medium, and returned to the loop, because a ship that treats agricultural water as a one-way expense will run dry long before it reaches its destination, regardless of how efficient its drinking water recycling happens to be. This is where the story of Biosphere 2 becomes relevant again, because water turned out to be one of the quieter, less publicized struggles inside that sealed structure, tangled up with almost everything else that went wrong. The project's designers had to account not just for drinking water, but for the water cycling through its miniature agricultural zones, its small artificial ocean, its rainforest section, all of it interconnected in ways that proved far more difficult to balance in practice than they had appeared on paper. Humidity levels swung in ways the team hadn't fully anticipated. Condensation gathered on surfaces nobody had modelled carefully enough. The sealed environment, precisely because it was sealed, amplified every small imbalance instead of allowing it to dissipate the way it naturally would have on the open earth, where a humid afternoon simply drifts away on the wind and gets replaced by tomorrow's different weather, arriving from somewhere else entirely. That's the deeper truth hiding underneath the water problem, and it's worth pulling out into the open, because it applies to nearly every system a generation ship has to solve. On Earth, imbalance dissipates. A drought in one region doesn't necessarily become a drought everywhere, because water moves, evaporates, falls as rain somewhere else entirely, arrives from oceans thousands of miles away, carried on weather systems nobody controls or even fully predicts. The planet is so enormous, and its water cycles so vast, that local failures rarely cascade into global ones. A sealed ship has no such luxury. There is no somewhere else for a local imbalance to drift toward. If humidity builds too high in the agricultural section, it doesn't blow away on a breeze from the Pacific. It stays, condenses somewhere it shouldn't, and becomes a maintenance problem, or a mold problem, or eventually a structural problem, because the ship is the entire world, and there is no larger system outside it to quietly absorb the mistake. Engineers who study these closed-loop systems have a phrase for what a generation ship's water system actually needs to achieve, and it's a phrase that sounds deceptively simple until you sit with what it actually demands. It needs to reach what's called dynamic equilibrium, a state where every input into the water cycle is precisely matched by a corresponding output, continuously, automatically, self-correcting whenever something shifts even slightly out of balance, without ever requiring a human being to notice the imbalance and intervene manually before it becomes dangerous. Earth achieves dynamic equilibrium in its own water cycle across a planet-sized system, using oceans as an almost infinitely forgiving buffer, capable of absorbing enormous swings in temperature, evaporation, and rainfall without the whole system ever coming close to failing. A ship has to achieve the same equilibrium using tanks, pipes, filters, and a handful of engineered wetlands or artificial reservoirs that are, by comparison to an ocean, almost laughably small. And it has to achieve that equilibrium not for a few decades, but for as long as the voyage lasts, monitored and maintained by successive generations of people who were never personally present for the original design decisions, working from documentation and training passed down like scripture, hoping the engineers who came before them got every calculation right. There's a strange, quiet intimacy to this particular problem that doesn't come up as often with air or food or gravity. The water on a generation ship is, in the most literal biochemical sense, a kind of inheritance. It passes physically, molecule by molecule, from one generation to the next, recovered and reused so many times over the centuries that by the time the ship reaches its destination, every person aboard has at some point been hydrated by water that once passed through the body of someone who never got to see the journey's end. It's a detail that sounds almost poetic when you say it slowly, and it is in its own way. But it's also, underneath the poetry, a hard engineering constraint with almost no room for error, a closed loop that has to hold without meaningful leakage. Across a span of time longer than most nations in recorded history have managed to survive intact, carrying inside it the only water tens of thousands of people will ever have access to for as long as they live, and for as long as their children and their children's children live after them. Part 5. The soil that has to remember how to be alive. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over agricultural researchers when they're asked how long it takes to build good soil, because the honest answer is almost cruelly patient. On Earth, forming even a single centimetre of fertile topsoil, the dark, crumbling, faintly sweet-smelling material that everything humanity eats ultimately depends on can take anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand years, depending on climate, rock type, and the slow, grinding work of weather and biology working together without anyone supervising the process. Soil isn't simply crushed rock. It's a living system, dense with bacteria, fungi, insects, and microscopic organisms numbering in the billions within a single handful, all of them working in a web of relationships so complex that scientists are still, even today, discovering species living inside ordinary garden soil that have never been formally identified before. A generation ship does not have a few thousand years to grow its own soil. It has to arrive with soil already alive, already functioning, already capable of doing the invisible chemical labor that turns a seed into a harvest. And it has to keep that soil alive in a sealed container, cut off from every natural process that normally replenishes it for the entire length of the voyage. This is where the story quietly turns away from mechanical engineering and into something closer to medicine, because keeping soil alive across centuries is, in a very real sense, keeping a patient alive on life support. Soil isn't a substance you can simply seal in a container and expect to remain unchanged, the way you might store a bag of sand. It's an ecosystem, and every ecosystem needs a continuous, balanced flow of nutrients moving through it, or it begins to break down, sometimes visibly, sometimes in ways that don't show themselves until a harvest fails, and nobody can immediately explain why. On Earth, this nutrient flow is maintained by a staggeringly large, largely invisible workforce. Earthworms tunnel through soil, aerating it and mixing organic matter downward. Fungal networks, some of them stretching for kilometers underground and connecting the root systems of entire forests, quietly trade nutrients between plants in relationships scientists are still working to fully understand. Bacteria fix nitrogen from the air, converting it into a form plants can actually use, a process so fundamental to agriculture that without it, most of the crops feeding the modern world simply could not grow at all. All of this happens continuously, self-regulating, replenished by dead leaves, fallen branches, animal waste, and the slow decay of anything that was once alive, cycling endlessly back into the soil to feed the next generation of growth. A ship's agricultural section has to replicate every part of that cycle using a closed system with a finite quantity of starting material, and this is precisely where the numbers from Biosphere 2 become genuinely instructive again, because soil health turned out to be one of the project's most persistent and least anticipated struggles. The team that designed the sealed structure had to bring in soil deliberately enriched with extra organic material, hoping to give their crops a strong enough nutrient base to sustain intensive agriculture across the full 2-year mission. It turned out to be, in hindsight, one of the contributing factors behind the facility's oxygen crisis, because that enriched soil contained far more organic matter than the researchers had fully accounted for, and the microbial communities living inside it consumed oxygen at rates high enough to meaningfully throw off the entire structure's atmospheric balance. The very soil built to keep the crops alive nearly suffocated the people breathing the air above it. That single detail captures something important about the whole problem of closed-system agriculture, and it's worth sitting with directly. Nutrient-rich soil and breathable air are not two separate engineering problems that happen to exist in the same building. They are the same problem, viewed from two different angles, coupled together so tightly that a decision made to help one system can quietly sabotage the other, and the only way to catch that kind of interaction before it becomes dangerous is to model the entire closed environment as a single integrated system rather than a checklist of separate components to be solved one at a time. A generation ship's designers, working from exactly this kind of hard-won lesson, have to think about soil not as a static resource loaded onto the ship once and then simply used, but as a living population that has to be actively managed, monitored, and replenished across centuries, the same way a ship's human population has to be managed to avoid genetic bottlenecks or demographic collapse. Nutrients removed from the soil by growing crops have to be returned to it, which means every scrap of plant waste, every stalk and root and unused leaf has to be composted and cycled back rather than discarded, and every bit of human and animal waste generated on board has to be processed and returned to the agricultural loop as well. Because on a ship this size, waste is not garbage. Waste is simply nutrients that haven't been reused yet. This changes the entire emotional register of what waste management means aboard a generation ship, and it's worth being honest about that shift rather than dancing around it. On Earth, we can afford to think of sewage as something to be treated and discarded, flushed away and forgotten, because the planet is large enough to absorb that loss, and because new nutrients are constantly being generated elsewhere, in forests, in oceans, in the enormous, slow churn of a biosphere that has been running for billions of years without needing to conserve every atom carefully. A ship cannot afford that luxury. Every atom of nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon that leaves the agricultural cycle without being recovered is an atom the ship will never get back, and across 4 centuries, even small ongoing losses compound into a genuine agricultural crisis, crops growing weaker and less productive with each passing generation as the soil, slowly and almost imperceptibly, starves. This is part of why many serious world ship studies place such heavy emphasis on what engineers call closed-loop nutrient cycling, systems specifically designed to capture and reprocess every possible source of organic waste on board, converting it back into usable soil amendments through composting and in more advanced proposals. Through engineered systems using specific strains of bacteria and fungi selected precisely because of how efficiently they break down waste and release nutrients back into a form plants can immediately use. Some proposals go further still, suggesting a generation ship would need to carry not just soil, but an entire deliberately curated microbiome. A carefully selected library of beneficial bacteria and fungal species chosen specifically for their resilience and their ability to support agriculture in a sealed artificial environment, essentially packing a miniature, hand-picked version of Earth's underground biological workforce and hoping it proves robust enough to keep functioning without the vast surrounding buffer of a full planetary ecosystem to draw on if something goes wrong. And something eventually does go wrong, because that is simply the nature of biological systems, closed or otherwise. Crop diseases exist on Earth in enormous numbers, and while a ship's agricultural planners would work hard to select disease-resistant crop varieties and maintain strict biosecurity protocols, centuries is an extraordinarily long time for a closed biological system to remain entirely free of pathogens, pests, or simple genetic drift within the crop varieties themselves. A disease that infects a single crop species in one region of Earth can be contained, quarantined, treated, or in the worst case, allowed to burn out in that one region while the rest of the planet's food supply remains entirely unaffected. A disease that infects a ship's primary staple crop threatens the food supply of everyone aboard simultaneously, because there is no neighbouring farm on a different continent to fall back on, no untouched harvest thousands of miles away that can be shipped in to cover the shortfall. This is why serious agricultural planning for a generation ship almost always includes redundancy as a core design principle rather than an afterthought. Multiple genetically distinct crop varieties grown in physically separated sections of the ship, so that a disease outbreak in one agricultural zone can be contained and doesn't threaten the entire food supply at once, along with deep, carefully preserved seed banks, essentially insurance policies against the day a particular crop variety fails catastrophically and needs to be replaced entirely, from stored genetic stock rather than bred back from whatever survives. There's something quietly humbling in all of this, something that tends to surface in conversations with the researchers who actually study these systems seriously. Every solution the ship needs, closed nutrient loops, diverse redundant crops, carefully balanced soil microbiomes, is really just an attempt to compress, imperfectly and at enormous cost, something Earth already does effortlessly at planetary scale for free, using nothing but sunlight and time and the patient accumulated labour of billions of years of evolution. A generation ship doesn't invent a new way to grow food. It tries, as faithfully and as carefully as human ingenuity allows, to smuggle a tiny, fragile fragment of Earth's oldest and most essential systems across the emptiest distance imaginable, and to keep that fragment alive and hungry and growing long after everyone who packed it aboard has been laid to rest in soil that once itself made the same impossible journey. Part 6. The gravity that has to be earned by spinning. There's a peculiar kind of vertigo that comes from realizing gravity is not, in any deep sense, guaranteed to you. You've spent your entire life with a downward pull so constant, so unbroken, that your inner ear, your bones, your circulatory system, your sense of which way is up. All of it developed around the quiet assumption that this pull would simply always be there. It has been there for every human being who ever lived, and for every ancestor before them, stretching back through hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Nothing about your body was designed with the possibility in mind that gravity might, one day, simply not show up. A generation ship has to manufacture that pull from nothing, and it has to keep manufacturing it correctly for centuries. Because the alternative is not a minor inconvenience, it's a slow, well-documented and thoroughly studied medical catastrophe. We already know, with uncomfortable precision, what happens to a human body deprived of gravity for extended periods. Because astronauts have been quietly serving as the experiment for decades. Bone density begins dropping almost immediately in microgravity, at rates that would take years to occur naturally through aging on Earth, because bones, it turns out, are not simply passive structural scaffolding. They are living tissue that responds directly to mechanical load, constantly rebuilding and reinforcing themselves in response to the stresses placed on them. And in the absence of gravity's constant tug, the body reads that lack of stress as a signal that the bone simply isn't needed anymore, and begins quietly dismantling it. Astronauts returning from long missions aboard the ISS can lose a meaningful percentage of their bone density over the course of a single mission, density that sometimes never fully recovers even after months back on Earth. Muscles waste in a similar way, particularly the muscles of the legs and lower back, which spend an entire lifetime on Earth fighting gravity every single time you stand, walk, or simply sit upright, and which weaken dramatically once that fight disappears. And that's before you reach the fluid shifts, which sound on paper like the least dramatic item on the list, and turn out, in practice, to be one of the most genuinely concerning. Without gravity pulling blood and other bodily fluids downward toward the legs the way it does constantly on Earth, fluid redistributes upward toward the head and chest, causing a puffiness in the face that astronauts sometimes jokingly call moon face, and causing pressure changes inside the skull that researchers have connected to a documented condition affecting astronaut vision on longer missions, a slow degradation of eyesight linked directly to the pressure microgravity places on the optic nerve over extended periods. A generation ship carrying children who are born, raised, and who grow old entirely without ever experiencing Earth normal gravity isn't dealing with a temporary medical inconvenience that resolves once the mission ends. It's dealing with an entire population whose bodies would develop from infancy without the mechanical stresses that shaped human skeletal and muscular structure across the whole of evolutionary history, and nobody currently knows with any real confidence what a human skeleton looks like after growing up entirely in weightlessness, because it has simply never happened, not once, in the whole of recorded human history. This is why nearly every serious world ship study treats artificial gravity not as an optional comfort feature, but as one of the non-negotiable, load-bearing requirements of the entire design, every bit as essential as breathable air or drinkable water. And the solution that keeps appearing independently across decades of separate engineering proposals is almost always some version of the same basic physical trick, spin. The principle itself is simple enough to demonstrate with something as ordinary as a bucket of water swung in a fast circle by its handle. Water that stays pressed firmly into the bottom of the bucket even when the bucket is momentarily upside down at the top of the swing, held there not by gravity but by the physics of circular motion, the same physics that presses you gently sideways into your seat when a car takes a fast, tight turn. Build a large enough rotating structure, spin it at a carefully chosen rate, and anyone standing on its inner surface experiences a force pressing them outward away from the center, that feels, for practical purposes, indistinguishable from ordinary gravity. Drop a cup and it falls toward the floor. Pour a glass of water and it pours downward, exactly as your body expects it to. But the physics of this trick comes with a genuinely brutal catch, one that every serious engineering study on the subject keeps running into, and it has to do with size. The comfort of that manufactured gravity, whether a human body experiences it as smooth and natural or as dizzying and nauseating, depends heavily on how large the rotating structure actually is, and specifically on how fast it has to spin to produce Earth normal gravity at a given radius. Spin a small structure fast enough to generate one full gravity at its rim, and the rotation rate required becomes uncomfortably, even dangerously high, fast enough that a person's inner ear begins detecting the rotation directly, producing a persistent, unpleasant dizziness, and fast enough that simply turning your head while standing, an action so automatic on Earth that nobody ever consciously thinks about it, can trigger a wave of disorientation. Because your head is briefly moving through a slightly different rotational speed than your feet. Engineering studies going back decades have converged, again and again, on a rough rule of thumb meant to keep this discomfort within tolerable limits, generally suggesting that a rotating habitat should spin no faster than roughly 1 to 3 rotations per minute to remain comfortable for long-term human habitation. And that rule, harmless as it sounds, quietly forces the entire structure to become enormous. To generate something close to Earth normal gravity at a rotation rate gentle enough for human comfort, the radius of the spinning section has to stretch out to hundreds of meters, and in some of the more ambitious world-ship proposals, kilometers, which means the artificial gravity system isn't a clever add on bolted to a smaller ship. It effectively determines the entire scale and shape of the vessel from the very beginning of the design process. You don't decide how big your ship needs to be and then figure out how to add gravity. You decide how gentle you need the gravity to feel, and the ship's size gets dictated to you as a direct mathematical consequence. This is one of the quiet reasons serious world ship concepts tend to look less like the sleek, compact spacecraft of popular imagination and more like enormous cylinders, Tory or wheel-shaped structures kilometers across, sometimes proposed as multiple linked rotating sections joined by a stationary, non-rotating central hub. The same basic architecture that kept resurfacing across the transcript U were shown earlier about O'Neill-style habitats, because the physics driving the design is exactly the same physics, whether the structure is orbiting Earth or crossing the gap between stars. The math doesn't care about the destination. It only cares about how gently a human inner ear needs to be treated to avoid 300 or 400 years of quiet, compounding nausea. And even once you accept that enormous scale, spin introduces its own subtler complications that ripple outward into nearly every other system on board. A rotating structure creates gravity that is, technically, slightly different at a person's head than at their feet, because the head, being closer to the axis of rotation, is moving through a marginally smaller circle than the feet. For a sufficiently large habitat, this difference is negligible, easily within the range the human body can comfortably tolerate without noticing. For a smaller structure, forced to spin faster to compensate for its reduced size, that difference becomes large enough to be genuinely uncomfortable. Another reason the math keeps pushing designers toward bigger and bigger structures rather than smaller, more compact ones. There's also the matter of what happens near the center of a rotating ship, the region closest to the axis, where the effective gravity drops towards zero regardless of how fast the outer rim happens to be spinning. Many world-ship proposals deliberately use this natural feature rather than fighting it, designing the central hub as a genuinely weightless zone reserved for tasks that actually benefit from an absence of gravity, heavy manufacturing and construction work, where massive components become easy to maneuver without their weight fighting against you. Certain kinds of scientific research that specifically require microgravity conditions to function properly, or simply as a maintenance and docking area where spacecraft, if the ship ever needs to launch smaller craft of its own, can depart and arrive without needing to fight the rotational forces present out at the rim. But engineering the physical structure to spin correctly is, in many ways, the more forgiving half of the gravity problem, because at least it can be tested, measured, and validated with reasonable confidence before the ship ever departs. The harder, less answerable question is the one no engineering study can fully resolve in advance, because it depends entirely on human biology rather than physics. What actually happens to a human body and a human mind that develops from infancy through old age, never once experiencing anything other than this manufactured rotational stand-in for gravity? Whether children raised entirely under spin-generated gravity develop skeletons meaningfully different from anyone born on Earth. Whether their inner ears, adapted from birth to the subtle rotational cues a spinning structure produces, would even function correctly if that same child somehow returned to a genuinely non-rotating environment. Whether, generations into the voyage, the very concept of normal gravity has quietly shifted in the bodies and instincts of everyone aboard into something no human being who ever lived on Earth would recognize as gravity at all. Nobody currently has a confident answer to any of that, because it has never happened. It remains one of the genuinely open, unresolved questions sitting at the center of the entire generation ship concept, a question that no amount of careful engineering can fully answer in advance. Because the only real experiment capable of testing it is the voyage itself, and by the time anyone learns the results, the ship will already be centuries deep into a journey with no way to turn back and try again. Part 7. The magnetic field a planet builds by accident. There's a particular kind of shield most people never think to thank, because it has never once failed in the entire span of human history, and something that never fails tends to become invisible. Roughly 3,000 kilometers beneath your feet right now, deep inside the Earth, an ocean of molten iron is slowly churning. Driven by heat left over from the planet's formation and by the slow, patient pull of gravity separating heavier material from lighter material as the planet's interior continues to settle, even after 4.5 billion years. That churning motion generates electric currents, and those currents generate a magnetic field, one that extends far out beyond the surface of the planet, wrapping the entire Earth in an invisible bubble that most people will spend their whole lives standing inside without ever consciously noticing it's there. That bubble is doing something for you right now that no other system on this list can fully replace, not perfectly, and possibly not at all. It's deflecting a constant, relentless stream of charged particles flowing outward from the sun. What scientists call the solar wind, along with far more energetic and far more dangerous particles arriving from deep space. Cosmic rays that originate from exploding stars and other violent events happening across the galaxy. Particles that would otherwise strike Earth's surface directly, tearing through living tissue at a molecular level, damaging DNA and over enough exposure, causing exactly the kind of cellular damage that leads to cancer and a long list of other radiation-related illnesses. A generation ship, once it leaves the shelter of Earth's magnetosphere and the Sun's own considerably larger magnetic bubble, the heliosphere, is entirely exposed to this radiation environment in a way almost nothing built by humanity has ever had to endure for an extended period. And this is precisely where the numbers become genuinely frightening, because radiation exposure in deep space isn't a minor background hazard that can simply be tolerated with occasional caution. Astronauts aboard the ISS, which still sits within the protective embrace of Earth's magnetic field, absorb radiation doses meaningfully higher than what a person experiences on Earth's surface, largely because they're above most of the atmosphere's own shielding effect, and NASA maintains strict career-long radiation exposure limits for its astronauts precisely because of this elevated risk. Limits that would be reached and dramatically exceeded within a matter of years, not centuries, by anyone traveling through deep interstellar space entirely unshielded. Beyond the protective bubble of the heliosphere, the radiation environment becomes considerably harsher still, dominated increasingly by galactic cosmic rays, which are not only more energetic than typical solar radiation, but also considerably harder to shield against, because they consist partly of heavy atomic nuclei traveling at extraordinary velocities, capable of punching through material that would easily stop lighter, slower particles. This is the same category of radiation that mission planners studying crewed trips to Mars have identified as one of the single most serious, unsolved obstacles standing in the way of that comparatively modest journey, a trip measured in months rather than centuries. And if radiation exposure remains a genuinely difficult problem to fully solve for a journey that short, the scale of the challenge facing a voyage lasting for multiple human generations becomes almost dizzying to consider seriously. So how does a ship even begin to approach this problem when the thing it's trying to replace is an ocean of molten iron the size of a planet's core, spinning for billions of years, generating a magnetic field that human engineering has never come remotely close to replicating at any meaningful scale? The most straightforward answer, and the one that appears most consistently across serious world-ship engineering studies, is almost defiantly unglamorous. Mass, simple, brute force physical shielding. Thick layers of material positioned between the ship's inhabited sections and open space, dense enough to absorb incoming radiation before it ever reaches human tissue. The same basic principle behind a lead apron in a dentist's office, just scaled up to the size of an entire vessel and maintained continuously for centuries. Water itself, it turns out, happens to be a remarkably effective radiation shield, dense enough to absorb a meaningful amount of incoming radiation while also serving double duty as part of the ship's water reserves, which is part of why several world-ship proposals suggest positioning water tanks strategically around a ship's inhabited core, turning a resource the ship needs to carry regardless into a second, quietly essential function as a protective barrier. But shielding through raw mass runs directly into the same brutal mathematics that governs every other part of a generation ship's design. The same rocket equation that makes carrying extra fuel exponentially more expensive the more of it you try to bring along. More shielding means more mass. More mass means more fuel required to accelerate that mass to the speeds needed to make the journey survivable in a single set of lifetimes rather than tens of thousands of years. And more fuel means in turn even more mass still, because that fuel itself has to be carried and accelerated right alongside everything else. Every kilogram of protective shielding added to the ship's design is a kilogram that has to be paid for in energy at every single stage of the journey, from initial acceleration all the way through to eventual deceleration at the destination. Assuming the ship intends to actually slow down and settle somewhere rather than simply flying past its target star system forever. This tension, between needing enough shielding to keep a population alive across centuries and needing to keep the ship's total mass low enough to actually be propelled across interstellar distances within a reasonable, survivable time frame, sits at the very center of nearly every serious world ship design study. And it's a tension that doesn't have a clean, satisfying resolution. Every proposal ends up making some kind of uncomfortable trade-off, accepting a certain elevated level of radiation exposure as the price of keeping the ship light enough to be practically buildable, and then trying to manage that residual risk through other, less brute force means. This is where some of the more genuinely ambitious proposals begin to look less like conventional spacecraft engineering and more like an attempt to recreate Earth's magnetic field artificially. An idea that sounds almost audacious the first time you encounter it seriously. Rather than relying purely on physical mass to block incoming radiation, some studies have explored the possibility of generating an artificial magnetic field around the ship itself, using large superconducting coils to create a magnetic bubble that would deflect charged particles away from the vessel, much the way Earth's own magnetosphere deflects the solar wind, without requiring the same overwhelming quantity of physical shielding mass. Early experimental work on this concept, sometimes referred to as a mini magnetosphere, has shown some genuine promise in laboratory settings and in proposals studied for shorter duration crewed missions closer to home. Though scaling the idea up to protect an entire generation ship continuously, without failure for centuries, remains firmly in the realm of theoretical engineering rather than anything close to a proven, ready-to-deploy technology. And even if such a system could be built successfully, it introduces its own quiet vulnerability into the ship's design, because unlike a thick physical wall of shielding material, which simply sits there passively doing its job, regardless of whether any other system on the ship happens to be functioning correctly, an active magnetic shield depends entirely on a continuous, uninterrupted supply of electrical power. It has to work every single moment of every single day for the entire multi-century voyage, because the instant it fails, even briefly, the ship's inhabitants become fully exposed to the raw radiation environment of deep space, with essentially no warning and very little time to react before meaningful biological damage begins accumulating. A ship's power system, whatever form it ultimately takes, whether nuclear fission, nuclear fusion, or some other advanced energy source not yet fully developed, would then carry the additional, almost unbearable burden of knowing that any prolonged failure doesn't simply mean the lights go dim for a while. It means the invisible shield the entire population depends on for their basic biological survival quietly switches off and stays off until someone manages to fix it. This is in many ways the cruelest lesson buried inside the whole radiation shielding problem, and it's a lesson that echoes forward into nearly every other system a generation ship depends on. Earth's magnetic field has never needed a backup generator. It has never needed a maintenance crew, a spare parts inventory, or a trained engineer standing by in case something goes wrong. Because it is not a machine in any sense a human being would recognize. It is simply the planet, quietly doing what molten iron does when left spinning for billions of years, asking nothing from anyone, requiring no attention, and offering no warning if it were ever somehow to fail, because it has never once come close to failing across the entire span of time life has existed on this world. A ship's version of that same protection, built from superconducting coils, or from thousands of tons of carefully positioned shielding mass, or more likely from some careful combination of both, will never have that same effortless permanence. It will always, in some sense, be a held breath, a system actively working continuously against the default emptiness of space, maintained by people who will never get to see it fail catastrophically, and also, if everything goes according to plan across 400 years of uninterrupted vigilance, will also never get to see it succeed in any way they could directly point to and celebrate, because a shield that works perfectly simply produces silence, an absence of harm so complete it becomes indistinguishable to the people living safely behind it from a hazard that was never really there at all. Part 8. The society that has to survive itself. Every system described so far, air, water, soil, gravity, radiation, is at least, in principle, a problem of physics and chemistry, the kind of problem that can be modelled, tested, refined, and eventually trusted to behave predictably as long as the mathematics has been done correctly. The next problem a generation ship has to solve is not that kind of problem at all, and it may quietly be the hardest one of the entire voyage. It is the problem of keeping several thousand human beings, and their children, and their children's children, from tearing the whole project apart from the inside, long before the ship ever reaches wherever it happens to be going. Start with a number that tends to catch people off guard the first time they encounter it seriously, because it comes not from science fiction, but from population genetics, the branch of biology concerned with how species maintain healthy genetic diversity across generations. Researchers studying the minimum viable population needed to sustain a healthy, genetically stable human community across multiple centuries, without the risks of inbreeding depression, reduced fertility, or the gradual accumulation of harmful recessive genetic conditions, have generally converged on numbers considerably higher than most people's first instinct would guess. Early rough estimates from decades ago suggested a population in the low thousands might be sufficient. More rigorous, more recent modelling, factoring in realistic birth rates, accident and disease mortality, and the genetic mathematics of maintaining diversity across dozens of successive generations without any possibility of introducing new genetic material from outside, has pushed serious estimates considerably higher, into the range of tens of thousands of individuals in some of the most careful studies on the subject. Sit with the implications of that number for a moment, because it quietly reshapes the entire character of the ship. This isn't a small, tight-knit crew, the kind of intimate, mission-focused team you might imagine aboard a research vessel or an early Mars outpost, everyone knowing everyone else, unified by a shared, immediate sense of purpose. Tens of thousands of people is a small city. It's a population large enough to contain strangers, factions, disagreements about resource allocation, generational conflicts between people who remember the launch and people who were born 100 years after it, and every single ordinary human social tension that exists inside any city on Earth today, except compressed inside a sealed hull, with genuinely nowhere for anyone to go if they decide they'd simply rather live somewhere else. This is where the engineering problem quietly becomes a governance problem, and it's a problem that every serious world ship study eventually has to address directly, even though it sits well outside the traditional boundaries of aerospace engineering. How do you structure a society from the very beginning so that it remains stable, cooperative, and functional across a span of time longer than most political systems in human history have ever managed to survive intact? The Roman Empire, at its most durable, lasted roughly half a millennium before fundamentally transforming into something its founders would barely have recognized. Most modern nation-states are, historically speaking, remarkably young, none of them having yet faced anything close to a 400-year unbroken test of their founding institutions. A generation ship asks its social and political structures to succeed at something almost no human civilization in recorded history has managed to accomplish, remaining stable, cooperative, and functionally intact across centuries, all while sealed inside a container with no ability to expand its territory, absorb immigrants, or simply let a dissatisfied population wander off and start somewhere new the way human societies have done again and again throughout history whenever internal tensions grew too severe to resolve peacefully in place. Researchers who study this problem, drawing on history, sociology, and organizational behavior as much as engineering, tend to identify a handful of recurring dangers that show up in one form or another across nearly every serious analysis of long-duration closed societies. The first is what might be called generational drift, the slow, almost imperceptible way that a population's understanding of and commitment to the original mission can erode over successive generations. The people who make the decision to launch a generation ship are by definition making that decision for themselves. The people born 100, 200, 300 years later never made that choice at all. They inherited it, the way a person inherits a family business or a family debt, and there is no guarantee, none whatsoever, that later generations will feel the same conviction about the mission's purpose that the original founders did. Some worldship studies explicitly worry about the risk of a population, generations into the voyage, simply losing interest in reaching the destination at all. Having built an entire functioning society and culture inside the ship itself, one that feels, to the people actually living inside it, like a complete and sufficient world in its own right, making the abstract promise of an unseen planet somewhere ahead feel less and less urgent with each passing generation. The second recurring danger is what sociologists studying isolated and confined environments, from polar research stations to submarine crews to early long-duration spaceflight missions, have documented repeatedly: the slow psychological toll of permanent, inescapable enclosure. Research conducted on personnel stationed at remote Antarctic outposts, which represent one of the closest real-world analogues available for studying long-term isolation in a small, sealed community, has documented a recurring pattern often referred to as third quarter syndrome, a decline in morale and cooperation that tends to emerge once a mission passes its temporal midpoint, once the initial adjustment period has worn off and the psychological relief of an eventual return home hasn't yet arrived close enough to feel real. A generation ship's version of this problem is considerably more severe because there is no midpoint anyone alive will actually experience personally, no eventual return home for the people currently living through the voyage to look forward to at all. Everyone aboard, for the entire multi-century duration, is living permanently in something uncomfortably close to that psychologically difficult middle stretch, with no individual crew member ever getting to personally witness the resolution their entire life has been oriented toward. The third danger, and arguably the most structurally dangerous of the three, is the simple, well-documented human tendency toward factionalism under conditions of scarcity and confinement. Historical and sociological research on closed communities, from isolated religious settlements to long-duration military deployments, consistently shows that small, sealed populations under sustained stress tend to fracture along whatever social fault lines happen to be available: competing families, competing professions, disagreements over resource allocation, disputes over authority and decision-making power. And once those fractures form inside a population with nowhere to disperse to and no outside authority capable of intervening, they tend to become entrenched rather than resolved, sometimes hardening across generations into genuinely dangerous internal divisions. This is why several serious world ship studies spend as much time discussing governance structures, education systems, and cultural design as they do discussing hull materials and propulsion systems, treating the ship's social architecture as being every bit as essential and every bit as carefully engineered as its physical architecture. Some proposals suggest deliberately building redundancy into the ship's social and administrative systems, the same way engineers build redundancy into its mechanical ones, distributing critical knowledge and decision-making authority widely enough across the population that the loss of any single leader, family, or faction can't catastrophically destabilize the entire community. The social equivalent of not routing every wire through a single point of failure. Others emphasize the importance of education systems specifically designed to preserve, across many generations, both the practical technical knowledge required to keep the ship's physical systems running and a clear, continually renewed cultural memory of the mission's original purpose. Treated less like a dry historical fact to be memorized and more like a living tradition, actively kept meaningful and emotionally resonant for people who will never personally see Earth or the destination world with their own eyes. And there's a genuinely uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this, one that researchers studying the ethics of generation ships have raised directly and haven't fully resolved. Every person born aboard a generation ship after its initial launch is born into a life, and eventually a death, entirely determined by a decision made by people who lived centuries before them. People they will never meet, deciding on their behalf that they would spend their entire existence confined within a sealed hull, working toward a destination they may never personally reach, having never been offered any meaningful choice in the matter at all. Some ethicists studying the concept have questioned whether launching a genuinely multi-generational voyage, one where most of the crew, by definition, are people who never consented to the mission because they hadn't been born yet when the choice was made, is even ethically defensible in the first place, regardless of how well every physical system aboard the ship happens to function. It's a question with no clean answer, and it's worth sitting with directly rather than rushing past it, because it reframes the entire engineering challenge in a way that pure physics and chemistry never quite manage to. A generation ship isn't simply a machine that has to keep several thousand bodies alive for 400 years. It's a machine that has to keep an entire evolving human society with its own internal disagreements, its own generational shifts in values and priorities, its own capacity for both extraordinary cooperation and extraordinary conflict, functioning well enough and cohesively enough that the mission itself survives the humans carrying it forward, long after every person who understood why the mission began in the first place has been gone for centuries, remembered if they're remembered at all, only through the stories their descendants choose to keep telling. Part 9. The seed vault that decides who arrives. Long before a generation ship ever leaves the ground, before the hull is even finished, before a single person has been selected to board it, someone has to answer a question that sounds almost bureaucratic on the surface, and turns out, the deeper you look into it, to be one of the most quietly consequential decisions of the entire mission. What exactly gets to come along? Not who. What? Because a ship carrying tens of thousands of people for centuries isn't just carrying those people, it's carrying every plant, every microbe, every strain of livestock, every species of insect it deliberately or accidentally brings with it, and every single one of those choices has permanent, irreversible consequences. Because unlike almost every other decision made over the course of the voyage, this one cannot be revisited later. There is no going back to Earth for a forgotten seed variety once the ship is a decade into its journey. Whatever biological material is loaded aboard on departure day is, for all practical purposes, the entire genetic inheritance the destination world will ever receive from Earth. This is where the story connects to something that already exists today, quietly, in an unremarkable-looking facility built into the side of a mountain on a remote Norwegian island well above the Arctic Circle. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault was built with a purpose that on the surface sounds almost identical to the problem facing a generation ship's agricultural planners. Preserving genetic diversity against a catastrophic, unpredictable future loss. The vault currently holds well over 1 million distinct seed samples drawn from crop varieties across virtually every country on Earth, stored deep inside permafrost specifically chosen because it keeps the seeds naturally frozen even without continuous power. A passive form of preservation designed to survive not just years of neglect, but potentially centuries, in the event that the electrical systems maintaining the facility's backup refrigeration were ever to fail entirely. The vault exists because agricultural researchers learned, sometimes through genuinely painful historical experience, just how fragile crop diversity actually is once a population becomes dependent on too narrow a genetic base. One of the most frequently cited examples in the field is the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s, when a population deeply dependent on a small number of genetically similar potato varieties found their entire staple food supply devastated almost simultaneously by a single fungal pathogen. Precisely because so little genetic diversity existed within the crop to provide any natural resistance. A more genetically diverse population of potato varieties, even carrying the same overall crop, would very likely have included at least some strains with enough natural resistance to survive the blight, but the varieties actually being grown at scale had, over generations of selective cultivation for yield and taste, been narrowed down to a dangerously small handful of closely related types. A generation ship faces a version of this problem that is, in some ways, considerably more severe than anything Earth's agricultural history has had to contend with, because Earth, even during a serious crop crisis, still retains its full underlying genetic reservoir distributed across wild relatives, isolated regional varieties, and facilities like Svalbard itself, ready to be drawn upon to rebuild a devastated crop from scratch if the worst happens. A ship carries only whatever genetic material was loaded aboard before departure. If a disease sweeps through the ship's primary staple crop 200 years into the voyage, and the ship's seed reserves don't happen to include a resistant variety, there is no wild relative growing somewhere else to fall back on. No neighbouring valley with an untouched heirloom strain that survived by pure geographic accident. Whatever wasn't packed, quite simply, does not exist anymore, anywhere, for anyone. This is why serious world-ship agricultural planning treats the initial seed and genetic stock selection as one of the single highest stakes decisions of the entire mission, deserving a level of scrutiny that, on the surface, might seem disproportionate to something as seemingly mundane as choosing which vegetable varieties to bring along. Planners have to select not simply for crops that grow well and taste good, but deliberately for genetic diversity itself, favouring a wider range of varieties over a narrower, more optimised selection. Specifically because that diversity functions as a form of biological insurance against threats nobody can predict in advance, whether that threat is disease, an unexpected nutrient deficiency in the ship's engineered soil, or subtle genetic drift accumulating across generations of seed saving and replanting inside a closed system where fresh genetic material can never again be introduced from outside. And crops are, in some ways, the more straightforward half of this problem, because they can at least be stored as dormant seeds, frozen or carefully dried, requiring relatively little active maintenance across the decades before they're actually needed for planting. Livestock, and the broader question of animal-based food sources more generally present a considerably harder version of the same dilemma, because you cannot simply freeze a cow the way you can freeze a seed and expect to thaw out a healthy, functioning animal centuries later. Some proposals for generation ships and long-duration space settlements have explored the possibility of carrying frozen embryos or genetic material for livestock rather than living animals themselves, intending to grow and raise actual animals only once the ship, or eventually the destination colony, has the agricultural capacity to properly support them. Using the same cryopreservation techniques already used today in cattle breeding programs on Earth, though scaling that technology to remain reliably viable across a span of centuries rather than the years or decades it's currently used for, remains a largely untested extension of existing science. There's also a harder, less comfortable question buried inside all of this. One that doesn't get discussed quite as often as crop diversity, and it concerns the human microbiome, the vast, largely invisible population of bacteria living inside and on every human body, which researchers have increasingly come to understand plays a genuinely essential role in digestion, immune function, and even, according to some more recent research, aspects of mental health and mood regulation. A generation ship's population isn't simply carrying its own individual genetic material forward across the centuries. It's carrying an entire accompanying ecosystem of microorganisms, and that microbiome, isolated for generations inside a sealed environment with a limited and unchanging set of foods, environmental exposures, and other people to exchange bacteria with, may itself begin to shift and narrow over time in ways nobody currently has strong data on, simply because nothing quite like this closed-loop, multi-generational isolation has ever been sustained and studied before. This is, in many ways, the quiet, unglamorous heart of what a generation ship's founders would actually be doing, whether or not they framed it to themselves in these terms. They wouldn't simply be selecting passengers and provisions for a journey. They would be making an irreversible decision about which fragment of Earth's 4 billion-year biological inheritance gets carried forward into an uncertain future, and which fragment gets left behind permanently on a planet that everyone aboard the ship, and every one of their descendants for the entire voyage, will never see again. Every seed variety not included, every livestock breed not preserved, every strain of beneficial soil bacteria not deliberately cultured and brought along, is a door quietly closing before the ship even leaves the ground, closing not just for the people currently making the decision, but for every single generation that will ever live and die aboard that ship, and for whatever population eventually steps off it, centuries later, onto a world their ancestors chose for them, carrying with them only whatever fragment of Earth someone, back at the very beginning, decided was important enough to save. Part 10. The parts that eventually run out. There's a particular kind of failure that engineers who study long-duration systems tend to worry about far more than the dramatic, catastrophic kind, and it's worth understanding why, because it doesn't announce itself the way an explosion or a hull breach would. It's the slow, grinding failure of ordinary hardware simply wearing out, the bearings, the seals, the pumps, the filters, the countless small mechanical parts that keep every other system on this list functioning, none of which were ever designed by anyone in the history of human manufacturing to run continuously without replacement for 400 years. This sounds at first like a problem you could simply solve with enough spare parts. And for the first several decades of a generation ship's voyage, that's more or less exactly how it would work. But spare parts, however carefully rationed, are still a finite resource loaded aboard the ship on departure day. and a voyage measured in centuries will, with mathematical certainty, eventually exhaust any supply of components manufactured before launch and never replenished since. This is the detail that quietly forces every serious world ship study to confront a problem considerably harder than simple storage logistics. The ship cannot merely carry spare parts. It has to carry the entire capacity to manufacture new ones, indefinitely, from raw materials, using tools and factories that themselves have to be maintained, repaired, and eventually replaced by successive generations of engineers who were never personally present when the original equipment was designed or built. This requirement, sometimes described in the engineering literature as closed-loop manufacturing, turns out to be one of the genuinely underappreciated pillars of the entire generation ship concept, arguably ranking alongside life support and artificial gravity in terms of how fundamentally it shapes the ship's design, even though it rarely receives the same attention in popular discussions of interstellar travel. A ship capable of true closed-loop manufacturing would need to carry not just raw materials, but the entire industrial base required to refine those materials, machine them into precise components, and assemble those components into working replacement parts, essentially an entire miniaturized version of Earth's industrial supply chain, compressed into a sealed hull and expected to keep functioning across a span of time longer than most industrial technologies on Earth have even existed in their current form. Consider, for a moment, how much has changed in manufacturing technology just across the last 100 years alone, a period considerably shorter than the voyage a generation ship would actually need to survive. The tools, materials, and manufacturing techniques considered standard practice a century ago would strike most modern engineers as almost quaintly primitive. And there is no particular reason to assume manufacturing technology will simply stop evolving once a ship departs Earth. This creates a genuinely strange design tension that doesn't have an obvious resolution. Do you build a ship's manufacturing systems around technology that is well understood, thoroughly tested, and reliably reproducible using the raw materials the ship will actually have access to, even if that technology is, by the standards of the era the ship departs in, already somewhat outdated? Or do you attempt to include more advanced manufacturing capability, accepting the added risk that comes with technology that hasn't yet accumulated decades of real-world reliability data, betting that its greater capability will prove worth the uncertainty across 4 centuries of continuous operation? Most serious studies on the subject lean, cautiously, toward the more conservative option, favoring proven, well understood, easily repairable technology over cutting-edge complexity, for a reason that becomes obvious once you think about who actually has to maintain these systems centuries into the voyage. The original engineers who designed and built the ship's manufacturing infrastructure will, by definition, be long dead well before any serious hardware crisis emerges deep into the journey. Whoever is actually troubleshooting a failing water pump 300 years after launch will be relying entirely on documentation, training, and accumulated institutional knowledge passed down across generations of crew members, none of whom personally witnessed the original design decisions, and all of whom are working from records that have themselves had to survive centuries of storage, copying, and translation across however many successive information systems the ship happens to use over its lifetime. This introduces a problem that sits at an unusual intersection of engineering and something closer to archival science. The question of how a ship preserves not just physical spare parts, but the actual knowledge required to build, repair, and eventually redesign its own critical systems across a span of time considerably longer than most written languages have remained mutually intelligible without meaningful drift. Historians studying how information degrades across centuries point to the simple, well-documented reality that languages change, technical terminology shifts, and even carefully preserved written records can become genuinely difficult for later generations to interpret correctly without careful, deliberate effort to keep that knowledge continuously alive, actively taught, and regularly updated rather than simply archived and left untouched. A repair manual written in the language and technical conventions of the ship's departure decade. If simply stored away and left unopened for 200 years, risks becoming, by the time it's actually needed in an emergency, something closer to a historical curiosity than a genuinely usable technical document, understood imperfectly by engineers working from a cultural and linguistic context the original authors never anticipated. This is why several world-ship studies place surprising emphasis on education and knowledge transmission as core engineering requirements in their own right, treating a ship's ongoing training programs, apprenticeship systems, and technical curricula with the same seriousness normally reserved for hull integrity or life support redundancy, precisely because a ship's physical systems are, in the end, only as reliable as the last generation's ability to actually understand, diagnose, and repair them correctly. A perfectly engineered manufacturing system left in the hands of a population that has gradually lost the technical knowledge required to operate it correctly becomes functionally no better than no manufacturing system at all, and arguably worse, because it creates a false sense of security right up until the moment something breaks and nobody aboard fully understands why. And there's a deeper structural problem sitting underneath even this, one that connects directly back to the question of raw materials. A closed-loop manufacturing system, however well maintained, still depends on the ship carrying a sufficient reserve of the actual physical elements required to build and repair its equipment, metals, rare minerals, specific chemical compounds needed for particular components, and unlike organic materials such as food or water, most of these raw materials cannot simply be recycled indefinitely without meaningful cumulative loss. Metal fatigue, chemical degradation, and the simple thermodynamic reality that no recycling process is ever perfectly efficient all mean that a ship's reserve of critical raw materials, much like its reserve of water discussed earlier, faces a slow, compounding depletion across the centuries that has to be accounted for from the very beginning of the design process. Treated as its own carefully rationed resource, monitored and managed with the same seriousness applied to breathable air or drinkable water. Some more ambitious world ship proposals attempt to address this by suggesting the ship might, at certain points along its journey, actually pause or slow its trajectory to mine raw materials from any asteroids, comets, or other small bodies it happens to pass reasonably close to along the way, essentially treating the vast emptiness of interstellar space not as entirely empty, but as a sparse, difficult-to-access resource field that a sufficiently patient and sufficiently well-equipped ship might, in principle, be able to draw on to replenish critical materials before they run dangerously low. It's an elegant idea on paper, and it does offer a theoretical solution to the raw material depletion problem, but it introduces its own considerable engineering complexity, requiring the ship to carry mining and refining equipment robust enough to actually process raw asteroid or cometary material into usable industrial feedstock, a capability that remains, even for uncrewed robotic missions operating within our own solar system today, still very much in its early experimental stages of development. What all of this adds up to, when you step back and look at the full shape of it, is a quiet but genuinely important reframing of what a generation ship actually is, underneath all the more visible. more frequently discussed systems like artificial gravity and closed-loop agriculture. It isn't simply a sealed biosphere carrying a fixed population toward a distant star. It's an entire self-contained industrial civilization, complete with its own manufacturing base, its own resource extraction capability, its own educational and knowledge preservation systems. All of it required to function not for a single generation, but continuously, reliably, and largely without external correction, for as long as it takes to cross a gap of space so large that light itself needs years just to make the trip. Every wrench, every replacement bearing, every spare filter cartridge the crew will ever use across 4 centuries has to either already be sitting somewhere aboard the ship on departure day, or the ship has to be capable of making a new one from scratch, using tools that someone, generations from now, still remembers how to operate correctly. Part 11. The moment nothing outside can help. There is a particular kind of confidence that quietly disappears the moment a ship crosses beyond the edge of Earth's protective reach, and it's worth naming directly because it's easy to underestimate just how much of modern human safety, even in space, still depends on the simple fact that help remains, at least in principle, reachable. Every crewed mission in the history of spaceflight, from the earliest orbital flights through decades of missions aboard the International Space Station, has operated with a safety net that a generation ship, by the very nature of its journey, permanently gives up the moment it leaves the solar system behind. Consider what that safety net has actually looked like in practice. Mission control, staffed around the clock by teams of specialists who can diagnose a malfunctioning system in real time, drawing on decades of accumulated engineering experience and, crucially, the ability to communicate with a crew in a matter of seconds or, at worst, a handful of minutes. A resupply pipeline capable of launching replacement hardware, medical supplies, or emergency equipment on a time scale measured in weeks rather than years. And, in the most severe scenarios, the ability to bring a crew home entirely, aborting a mission, and returning astronauts to the full medical and technical resources of an entire planet, if a problem proves serious enough that continuing simply isn't survivable. A generation ship has none of this at any point for the entire multi-century duration of its voyage, and the scale of that isolation only becomes fully clear once you actually run the numbers on communication delay across interstellar distances. Radio signals, like all electromagnetic radiation, travel at the speed of light, the fastest possible speed anything can move through the universe. And even at that speed, a message sent from a ship years into its journey toward even the nearest plausible star system would take years, not seconds, not hours, but years, to reach Earth, and years more for any response to make the return trip. By the time a ship several decades into its voyage transmits a description of a serious problem back toward Earth, and Earth's own scientists and engineers manage to analyze it and transmit a recommended solution back across that same vast gap, the situation aboard the ship, whatever it originally was, will likely have already resolved itself in one direction or another, for better or for worse, entirely without any outside input at all. This effectively means that real-time troubleshooting, the kind every previous crewed space mission in human history has relied on as an absolutely fundamental safety mechanism, simply ceases to exist as an option almost immediately after a generation ship departs. Whatever expertise the crew happens to carry aboard, in the specific people currently alive and serving in relevant technical roles at any given moment during the centuries-long voyage, is, for all practical purposes, the entire sum of engineering, medical, and scientific knowledge the ship will ever have direct access to for as long as the journey lasts. There is no calling ahead for a specialist. There is no waiting for a shipment of a rare replacement part. There is only whoever happens to be aboard, right now, at this particular point in the voyage, and whatever they collectively know, remember, and have been trained to do. This reality forces a particular kind of redundancy into the ship's design that goes considerably beyond simply carrying backup hardware, extending into what might be called institutional or knowledge-based redundancy, ensuring that critical technical and medical expertise is never concentrated in too few individuals at any given time. Because the death or incapacitation of a single key specialist, an event that would be a manageable, even routine personnel challenge on Earth, where a replacement could simply be trained, hired, or flown in, becomes, aboard a ship with no possibility of outside reinforcement, a genuinely existential risk if that person happened to hold irreplaceable knowledge nobody else aboard fully understood. This is part of why several serious worldship studies place heavy emphasis not just on initial crew selection, but on continuous, deliberately structured cross-training and mentorship systems, designed specifically to ensure that critical skills, whether medical, mechanical, agricultural, or navigational, are always distributed across multiple individuals and, crucially, across multiple generations simultaneously, so that knowledge is never held by a single aging expert who might die unexpectedly before adequately passing that expertise on to a successor. It's a problem that has a direct, if smaller scale, precedent in certain highly specialized professions on Earth, submarine crews serving on nuclear vessels, for instance, which spend months at a time fully submerged and genuinely cut off from immediate outside support, and which have, over decades of naval experience, developed rigorous internal training and redundancy protocols specifically because a submarine crew, like a generation ship's crew, cannot simply call for outside help the moment something serious goes wrong hundreds of meters beneath the ocean's surface. But even the most rigorous training and redundancy systems can only prepare a crew for problems that were, at some level, anticipated in advance, and this is where the true, unavoidable danger of complete isolation becomes clearest. Across 400 years of continuous operation, it becomes not just possible but genuinely likely that the ship will eventually encounter some kind of problem, whether mechanical, biological, or medical, that nobody aboard has ever personally seen before, and that no training program, however thorough, specifically prepared them to solve. This isn't a failure of planning. It's simply the honest, unavoidable mathematics of running any sufficiently complex system continuously for a period of time longer than most entire technological eras in recorded human history. A period long enough that genuinely novel failure modes, the kind that don't show up in any manual because nobody who wrote the manual ever encountered them, become not just possible, but statistically expected to occur at some point along the way. This is where a generation ship's crew faces a challenge that no previous human expedition, however remote or however dangerous, has ever had to fully contend with: the requirement to be not simply well-trained operators of existing systems, but genuine, capable scientists and engineers in their own right, able to diagnose entirely novel problems from first principles, using whatever theoretical scientific understanding and practical tools happen to be available aboard the ship at that particular point in the voyage, because there is, quite literally, no one else anywhere in the universe they can call for a second opinion. Some worldship studies explicitly emphasize this point, arguing that a successful generation ship cannot simply carry a population trained to follow procedures. It has to carry and continuously renew across every generation a population genuinely capable of original scientific and engineering thought, preserving not just specific technical knowledge, but the deeper underlying scientific literacy required to generate new solutions to problems nobody anticipated in advance, essentially requiring the ship to maintain indefinitely. Something functionally equivalent to an entire small nation's worth of scientific research capacity sealed inside a hull, with no university, no research institution, and no broader scientific community anywhere within reach to draw upon or collaborate with. And underneath all of this sits a genuinely sobering realization, one that tends to settle over people slowly rather than arriving all at once. Every single decision made aboard a generation ship, from the moment it departs Earth's solar system until the moment, centuries later, it finally reaches wherever it happens to be going, has to be made entirely by the people currently alive and present aboard the ship at that exact moment, using only the knowledge, tools, and resources they currently have on hand. There is no higher authority to appeal to, no greater reservoir of expertise waiting somewhere else to be consulted, no possibility, ever, of simply waiting for outside help to arrive, because outside help does not exist, has never existed for this journey, and will not exist again until the ship itself finally becomes the outside help for whatever new world its descendants eventually step onto. Centuries after everyone who understood exactly why the voyage began in the first place has long since passed away, remembered only in whatever fragments of story and instruction survived the long, silent crossing between the stars. Part 12. The world that was never really a ship. By the time you stack every one of these systems together, air that has to forget it was manufactured, water inherited molecule by molecule from strangers centuries dead, soil kept alive the way you'd keep a patient alive, gravity earned only by spinning fast enough and far enough to fool an inner ear that has never once been wrong about anything before. A magnetic shield held open by continuous power with no room for even a brief lapse. A society engineered to survive itself for longer than most empires have managed. A seed vault deciding which fragments of 4 billion years of evolution get to continue existing anywhere at all. A manufacturing base that has to keep working long after everyone who built it is gone. And an isolation so complete that help in any form simply stops being a concept that applies anymore, you start to see why the honest name for this thing was never quite spaceship. A spaceship, in the way most of us picture the word, is a vehicle. It takes you somewhere and then, in some sense, it's done. Its job complete, ready to be parked, refueled, or retired. What we've actually been describing tonight is not a vehicle at all. It's a planet, compressed down to a scale small enough to fit inside a hull, and asked to do, continuously and without failure, everything a planet does by accident, using nothing but deliberate human engineering and an unbroken chain of people who have to understand, generation after generation, why every single one of those systems matters. And here's the part that's worth sitting with quietly before we close, because it's easy to hear all of this as a story about the future, about some hypothetical ship departing centuries from now toward a star most of us will never learn the name of. But look again at everything on that list. Breathable air, kept in careful balance by systems nobody sees. Drinkable water, cycling endlessly through bodies and back again. Soil, alive with organisms doing work no machine has ever fully replicated. A magnetic shield generated by processes so old and so quiet that nobody alive has ever consciously felt its absence. A society, however imperfect, that has somehow managed to hold itself together for longer than any generation ship has yet attempted. That's not a description of some future spacecraft. That's a description of the planet currently keeping you alive right now, tonight, as you lie there listening to this. Earth has been running every single one of these systems flawlessly for longer than human beings have existed to notice, let alone thank it. No engineer designed its atmosphere. No maintenance crew services its magnetic field. No committee decided how much genetic diversity its soil microbes would need to survive the next 10,000 years. It simply does all of it continuously for free, without asking anything of you in return except, perhaps, that you not take it quite so entirely for granted. The strange gift hiding inside the whole idea of a generation ship, the reason engineers and physicists keep returning to a project so difficult it borders on the impossible, isn't really about reaching another star at all. It's about what happens when you're finally forced to write down, in exhausting, unforgiving technical detail, every single thing a planet does for you that you never once had to ask it to do. You start to see Earth differently. Not as scenery, not as a backdrop for the more interesting story of humanity's clever machines and ambitious journeys, but as the single most sophisticated life support system anyone has ever encountered, running so smoothly and so quietly that it took the impossible engineering challenge of trying to replace it before anyone thought to sit down and actually list everything it was doing. Maybe that's the real reason to build a ship like this one day, not simply the ambition of reaching somewhere new, but the humility of finally understanding, in complete and total technical detail, exactly how much we were given all along by the one world that never once needed a spare part, never once required a repair manual, and never once, not for a single second, across 4.5 billion years, forgot how to keep something alive. The ship, if it's ever built, will spend centuries trying to become a planet. Down here, we already have one. It's still running tonight, quietly, in the dark, doing everything it has always done, whether or not anyone happens to be awake to notice. So if tonight, lying there in the dark, you happen to hear the quiet hum of your own refrigerator, or feel the faint pull of gravity keeping you settled into the mattress, or simply breathe in without thinking about it, let that be enough for a moment. No hull is holding that air in place for you. No spinning wheel is manufacturing that gentle downward pull. It's just Earth, doing what it has always done, asking nothing back. Somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, in the quiet math of engineers who take this seriously, a ship is still waiting to be built, one that will spend 400 years trying to become what you already have for free tonight. If this kind of slow, careful wondering is something you'd like more of, drifting off beside you the next time the lights go down, consider staying a little longer here at the Sleepless Curiosity, and let sleep find you exactly where you are.